I think music. The moment hit the country like a ton of bricks. Tears, silence, and an official confirmation that changed everything. When a brief statement was released from the palace early that morning, it was immediately clear that this was no routine announcement. No rumors, no denial, no placating phrases. Just a stark truth that dominated the headlines within minutes. At the center of it all were Prince William music, Catherine, Princess of Wales, and their youngest son, Prince Louis. What initially seemed like a formal announcement quickly turned out to be one of the most emotional chapters in recent royal history. The timing was precise, almost relentless. At exactly 8:06 a.m., the statement reached the public. Newsrooms across the country suspended normal broadcasting. Anchors changed their audio, and the nation paused. The content of the statement was deliberately brief, but its impact was enormous. It confirmed that Prince Louis was facing a medical condition requiring long-term care. No details, music. No prognosis, no medical jargon. It was precisely this restraint that lent its weight. What followed was an immediate emotional reaction. People stopped music on train platforms, looked at their phones, and reread the same sentences over and over. In that moment, the line between monarchy and the public blurred. Music. The message didn't seem detached or strategic, but human. Observers noted that the tone was distinctly different from previous royal pronouncements. It wasn't about duty or institution, but about family. Behind the scenes, this moment had been brewing for a long time. Within the palace, the atmosphere had been tense for weeks. Appointments were reduced, procedures quietly adjusted, without any outward signification. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had insisted that the statement come from her personally, not as a representative of the crown, but as a mother. This approach shaped the perception of the entire message and sent a powerful signal. Prince William's reaction was particularly striking. Normally known for being controlled and composed, he appeared visibly shaken in the hours following the announcement. Observers close to the palace reported an emotionality rarely associated publicly with the heir to the throne. Tears behind closed doors, profound shock, but also a determination to focus on protection and stability. For many, this was an unfamiliar image. The future king not as a symbol of continuity, but as a father in a state of emergency. The surrounding community also reacted noticeably. Staff members moved more quietly. Conversations were hushed, and decisions were made with particular caution. Experienced members of the royal family signaled restraint and support. It was obvious that this was not a strategic crisis, but a deeply personal one. At that moment, the palace walls offered less protection from the public than from further upheaval. Outside the gates, people gathered spontaneously, without any staging. No shouts, no overt displays of sympathy. Only silent expressions of grief, handwritten notes, flowers, brief messages, gestures that made clear how deeply this news affected people. Commentators spoke of a rare moment of collective empathy in which title and rank lost their significance. The opening to this story was deliberately blunt. No lengthy explanations, no gradual build-up. Therein lay its power. The clear, direct communication made it clear that nothing was to be sugar-coated. At the same time, it allowed room for compassion and respect for privacy. This balancing act was perceived by many as courageous. At the end of this first chapter lies a question that extends beyond the immediate situation. Has this openness permanently changed the relationship between the public and the monarchy? Or is it an exceptional situation that will soon be replaced by distance? Long before the official confirmation was published, subtle signs had been building up behind palace walls. Outwardly, everything remained orderly, but internally, it was palpable that something was amiss. Observers familiar with the family's daily routine noticed small shifts in the schedule, which initially went largely unnoticed. Appointments with Prince Louis became less frequent. Planned appearances disappeared from internal calendars without explanation. To the public, these appeared to be normal adjustments, but within the family, concern grew. At the center of this early phase was Catherine, Princess of Wales. As a mother, she noticed that her youngest son's rhythm was changing. Moments that seemed insignificant to outsiders took on a different weight for her. Prince Louis, usually known for his lively and energetic nature, seemed unusually quiet at times. Playtime shortened, breaks became more frequent. These changes were subtle but consistent enough to attract attention. Initially, nothing was rushed. Within the family, there was a desire to remain calm and avoid jumping to conclusions. But over time, the observations could no longer be ignored. Daily life was adjusted discreetly. Routines changed, routes were shortened, and workloads reduced. All of this happened away from the cameras, in an environment that is otherwise meticulously planned. It was precisely these deviations from the usual routine that signaled how seriously the situation was being taken. Prince William was also involved in this phase, albeit in a different way. As heir to the throne, he continued to bear his responsibilities, but his attention increasingly shifted to his private life. Reports from his inner circle describe his behavior as vigilant and tense. Every change was noted, every subtle hint re-evaluated. The balance between his public role and family responsibilities began to waver. Simultaneously, a series of discreet medical examinations began. No conspicuous journeys, no visible security measures that could have attracted attention. Everything was controlled, almost invisible. Within the palace, only a very small circle was aware of the situation. This reticence was no accident, but part of a deliberate strategy to buy time and avoid speculation. Particularly noteworthy was the dramatic shift in family dynamics. Prince Louis increasingly became the center of attention, without this being outwardly apparent. His siblings stayed closer to him. Routines were reorganized to be more family-oriented. Observers later described this period as a time when closeness and attention became more important than any form of public display. The monarchy receded into the background. Parenthood took center stage. Despite all precautions, the tension within him grew. Each new observation reinforced the feeling that this was not a temporary phase. This uncertainty was harder to bear than clear certainty. Within the palace walls, there was an atmosphere of waiting, of quiet hope that everything could be explained and put into perspective. But it was precisely this hope that made the situation so burdensome. The early warning signs were not a dramatic turning point, but a slow, almost imperceptible shift in reality. Therein lay their gravity. For Catherine, Princess of Wales, it meant making decisions without yet having answers. For Prince William, it meant relinquishing control in an environment otherwise based on control. And for Prince Louis, a period began whose significance he himself could not yet grasp. In retrospect, it becomes clear that these weeks laid the foundation for everything that followed. They shaped the family's response to the situation and explained why the subsequent disclosure was so deliberate and limited. The question, however, remains open. Would an earlier public admission have been possible, or was this cautious silence the only way to protect the family? The day of the diagnosis marked the point at which quiet concern became irreversible certainty. An unusual silence reigned within the palace that morning. Routines continued, but they seemed subdued, almost cautious. Everything that had previously been considered a possibility now solidified into a clear medical assessment. For Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Prince William, this moment meant not only new information but also the shattering of their hope that the abnormalities would simply resolve themselves. The final results were delivered without any dramatization. No haste, no panic, no dramatic embellishment. It was precisely this matter-of-factness that amplified the impact. It became clear that this was not a short-term phase but a situation that would require long-term adjustments. The findings left no room for interpretation, but certainly for emotion. Within minutes, the entire family's outlook on the future changed. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was particularly striking in her reaction. Outwardly, she remained composed, but inwardly, a process of reorganization began. Deadlines, priorities, expectations. Everything had to be reassessed. Observers later reported that she checked the information multiple times, absorbing every detail, without revealing anything to the outside world. This phase was characterized by concentration and inner tension, rather than visible despair. For Prince William, the diagnosis brought a different kind of shock. As someone who had been prepared his entire life for responsibility and the future, he was struck by the realization that there are areas that cannot be planned or controlled. The role of heir to the throne receded into the background at that moment. His primary focus was the responsibility of being a father, confronted with a reality that offered no clear answers but demanded adaptability. Within the family, the news was initially kept quiet. There were no immediate briefings, no involvement of a wider circle. This reticence was deliberate. The diagnosis first had to be processed internally before it could be made public in any way. During this phase, family life changed noticeably. The focus shifted more towards routines, stability, and trying to maintain normality wherever possible. At the same time, a quiet restructuring began behind the scenes. Appointments were reviewed, future commitments reassessed. Anything that could have created additional pressure was questioned. The diagnosis acted like a filter through which every decision had to pass. What had previously been taken for granted was now carefully considered. These adjustments remained hidden from the public eye, but they profoundly shaped the family's daily life. The handling of Prince Louis himself was particularly sensitive. His daily routine was carefully adapted without making him feel like he was at the center of a crisis. Observers later emphasized how important it was for Catherine, Princess of Wales, to convey stability while simultaneously responding to new needs. This balancing act between protection and normality presented one of the greatest challenges. The palace as an institution also reacted. Security and data protection measures were reviewed, access restricted, and information strictly controlled. Not out of mistrust, but out of an awareness of how quickly sensitive content can be distorted in the public sphere. The diagnosis was medical, but its impact was political and social. Any uncontrolled flow of information would have triggered speculation that would have been virtually impossible to stop. With the diagnosis, it was clear that silence would not remain an option in the long run. At the same time, it was clear that a premature disclosure could do more harm than good. This tension defined the following days. The family was in a state of transition between internal processing and external pressure. Nothing was the same anymore, yet no one outside their inner circle knew. At the end of this section, a crucial question arises. How long can such a profound truth remain hidden before external pressure becomes greater than the desire for protection and control? The diagnosis marked the beginning of a phase that remained invisible to the outside world, but changed everything internally. Prince William, in particular, now faced pressure that was fundamentally different from anything he had experienced before. Public responsibility, stately appearances, and years of preparation for the role of heir to the throne had taught him to maintain control. But this situation defied all control. Behind the palace walls, a man emerged who was not acting as a future king, but as a father whose self-image had been shaken. Observers from his inner circle reported a palpable change. The usually precise structure of his daily life lost its meaning. Movements seemed slower, decisions heavier. The inner tension could no longer be completely concealed. It was not a public breakdown, but a quiet, progressive process that erupted in moments of isolation. It was precisely this silence that made the situation so poignant. During this time, Prince William frequently withdrew. Walks alone, extended stays in secluded areas of the estate, reduced communication. All of this pointed to an inner struggle. The burden consisted not only of worry for Prince Louis, but also of guilt. In retrospect, small signs were reinterpreted, past decisions questioned. This reflection followed no rational logic, but rather the emotional need to find meaning in what had happened. At the same time, Catherine, Princess of Wales, tried to maintain stability. Her role was less visible, but no less central. She acted as a calming influence as the emotional weight increasingly shifted to Prince William. The interplay between the two changed. Decisions were made more jointly, responsibilities more consciously shared. The focus was on creating a secure framework in which uncertainty could at least be contained. The emotional strain reached its peak in moments hidden from the public eye. No cameras, no official engagements, no prepared appearances. In these moments, the extent to which the situation shook the foundations became apparent. The breakdown was not a single event, but a series of quiet moments in which the facade of control crumbled. This very invisibility made it clear how little the public suspected of the reality behind the headlines. This state of affairs did not go unnoticed within the palace either. Staff reacted with restraint. Tasks were redistributed, workloads reduced. There were no formal instructions, but rather a tacit understanding that priorities had shifted. The institution did not respond with protocol, but with human adaptation. This response was unusual and demonstrated the seriousness with which the situation was being assessed. For Prince William, this period meant a reassessment of his role. The long-term perspective as heir to the throne receded into the background, while the immediate responsibility of being a father took center stage. This shift was not only emotional but also symbolic. It showed that even within the monarchy, personal boundaries exist that cannot be transgressed by duty. As time progressed, however, it became clear that withdrawal alone was not the solution. The emotional processing could not continue indefinitely in secret. External pressure mounted, and the internal strain threatened to intensify further. This state of affairs marked the transition to a new phase in which decisions could no longer be postponed. At the end of this chapter, a central question arises. Can a future king, in a moment of profound personal crisis, simultaneously demonstrate strength and allow vulnerability without either being interpreted as weakness? The turning point didn't come with a major revelation, but with a gradual loss of control. While the family tried to reorganize their daily lives, a dynamic began to unfold outside the palace walls that was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Absences were recorded, changes in schedules were interpreted, and the smallest details were blown out of proportion. What was considered a necessary protective measure internally became fertile ground for speculation externally. This is precisely where the real conflict began, the struggle for privacy in an environment that thrives on constant surveillance. Within a few days, evidence mounted that information was circulating without official confirmation. No concrete details, but enough hints to fuel media interest. The pressure mounted noticeably. Inquiries multiplied. The tone became more insistent, and the line between journalistic interest and sensationalism began to blur. For the family, it was clear that remaining silent was becoming increasingly risky. Not because the truth should be hidden, but because distortion threatened. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was particularly sensitive to this development. For her, the public perception was not the primary concern, but rather the extent to which speculation could negatively impact Prince Louis's life. Music. Once a false narrative is established, it is almost impossible to correct. This very concern dominated internal discussions. The decision was not whether to speak out, but how and when. Prince William, too, recognized that waiting music was no longer an option. The period of withdrawal had reached its limit. Protecting the family now required actively managing communication, not out of calculation but out of necessity. The goal was clear: to regain control without revealing details that could harm the child in the long term. This balancing act represented one of the most difficult challenges the family had ever faced. Intensive discussions took place within the palace. Drafts were created, discarded, and reformulated. The tone was crucial. Too cool would have signaled distance. Too emotional would have triggered further speculation. The solution lay in unusual clarity, a statement that neither glossed over nor dramatized the situation. Observers described this process as remarkably atypical for the otherwise highly regulated communications of the royal family. The real break with tradition lay in not relinquishing control to advisors or institutions. Catherine, Princess of Wales, insisted that the message remain authentic. No official language, no medical explanations, no justifications. This approach was risky but consistent. It signaled that this was not about image management, but about protection and honesty. Once the decision had been made, the atmosphere noticeably changed. The tension didn't dissipate, but it took on a direction. Preparation replaced uncertainty. The moment of release was meticulously planned to preempt speculation. This control over timing was crucial. It made it clear that the family was acting, not reacting. After the release, it quickly became apparent that this approach was effective. The tone of the reporting changed. Instead of wild speculation, restraint and respect prevailed. This had been precisely the goal, not to generate attention but to guide it. This phase demonstrated the power of clear communication when driven by responsibility rather than fear. Yet, despite this short-term reassurance, uncertainty lingered. Openness had provided protection but also created a new vulnerability. The question now hanging in the air was unavoidable. Can a family that takes such a personal step into the public eye truly define its limits in the long run, or does every disclosure simply increase expectations for more? After the statement was released, the mood across the country noticeably shifted. What had begun as a potential media storm transformed surprisingly quickly into a moment of collective restraint. The reactions were intense but not intrusive. Instead of demands for details, expressions of sympathy prevailed. For many observers, this marked a rare moment when the public and the monarchy converged on an emotional level. People gathered around the palace not out of curiosity, but out of solidarity. No loud gestures, no stage displays, just quiet presence. This reaction was described by commentators as extraordinary. It showed that the chosen openness had had an effect. The message had been understood. It wasn't about sensationalism, but about protection. Prince Louis moved into the center of public sympathy without becoming the object of speculation. For Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Prince William, however, this did not signify an end, but the beginning of a new reality. Their public roles remained, but their importance shifted. Appointments were reprioritized. Commitments weighed more carefully. The benchmark was no longer solely the institution, but the family's equilibrium. This adjustment was seen by many as a sign of a more modern understanding of responsibility. A change was also evident within the royal family. Interactions became closer, more direct, less governed by protocol. Support was offered quietly, without public gestures. This restraint reinforced the impression that this was a situation that was deliberately not to be politicized or exploited. Instead, family unity was paramount. In the long term, this development raises questions that extend beyond the immediate situation. The monarchy thrives on distance and continuity, yet this episode demonstrated the powerful impact of closeness. The disclosure, however limited, fundamentally altered perceptions. Prince William was seen not only as heir to the throne, but as a father confronted with a situation devoid of hierarchy. This human dimension lent new depth to his role. For Prince Louis himself, the future primarily means adaptation. His daily life will be structured differently, more cautiously and more closely protected. The public will likely see him less frequently, but this very reticence could ultimately create stability. The decision not to disclose details sets clear boundaries and redefines what public interest is permitted to achieve. Overall, this episode is more than just a news story about a royal family. It reflects how societal expectations have shifted. Sensitivity, respect, and restraint are increasingly demanded, even by media outlets that otherwise prioritize speed and sensationalism. Whether this approach will endure remains to be seen. This chapter concludes with an outlook that contains both hope and uncertainty. Will this new form of openness make the monarchy permanently more human? Or is it an exception accepted only in times of crisis? The events surrounding Prince Louis mark a turning point that extends far beyond the specific incident. It began with a concise, factual statement whose impact stemmed not from details, but from its tone. It made clear that even in an institution that stands for stability and distance, personal realities can play a central role. The deliberate omission of medical details created space for empathy without overstepping boundaries. For Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Prince William, this period meant a fundamental reassessment of their roles. Public duties temporarily took a back seat to familial responsibilities. This prioritization was not perceived as a weakness, but as an expression of strength. It demonstrated that leadership can also consist of providing protection and setting boundaries. The public reaction confirmed this approach. Respect prevailed over sensationalism. This shift in tone points to a changed relationship between the monarchy, the media, and society. Closeness was accepted without creating a demand for complete transparency. This very balance proved crucial. In the long term, it remains to be seen what impact this event will have on the perception of the monarchy. What is certain, however, is that the family surrounding Prince William was defined at that moment not by title or tradition, but by their humanity. The story of Prince Louis is thus not just a personal chapter, but a symbol of a possible shift in the way we deal with public and private life.